Hello, I'm Roger Pearman, and there were a couple of comments I wanted to make before I start my presentation. I'm delighted to be a part of this special symposium sponsored by the British Association for Psychological Type. What many people may not know about my particular journey with type is that really it started in the early 70s. In my first professional work, I was the director of a university learning center, which really started a pretty serious taking a look at type as measured by, sorted by the MBTI. It was in those early 80 years, 1981, when I met Mary McCauley and became involved with the Association for Psychological Type, and eventually the president of the International Association. And after my years of being a director in a university learning center, I went into the corporate world where I was the director of all things related to human resources, the chief human resource officer responsible for all of our training activities, both external activities, meaning the services we provided to clients, as well as our internal leadership development initiatives. And all of those activities, type was very much a part of. The utilization of type, if you will, knowledge to help both individuals grow and organizations to understand the nature of various dynamics within their organizations. And then I decided to leave corporate life and I started my own training and development company. Eventually created qualifying.org, which was the first blended learning certification company on the planet related to helping people become certified and qualified to use a variety of psychological tools, including the MBTI. Over time, I shifted most of my work and attention into talent management. And if you will, in the newest firm with my business partner, Bob Eichinger, we continue, if you will, to use psychological type, and we use a variety of tools to help us get there. My main point in giving you this biography is really, I guess, twofold. One, I've been utilizing psychological type for quite a period of time in multiple environments, academic, corporate, and then in my own, if you will, coaching and training development initiatives. I've also used opportunities to do research and publish in a variety of forums around psychological type and how type can be useful in practical ways. So I am a pragmatic individual, and my primary interest and focus in using psychological type has been the ways in which type can practically help people in their growth and development. I'm very pleased to be a part of today's piece, today's symposium. And my goal is to review with you my, if you will, my research data over time around psychological type, and to make sure that the themes and patterns I've observed you can take a peek at and hopefully find it useful and instructive for you. So the title of this talk is Observations, Trends, and Propositions, the Merits and Potentials of Psychological Type in a New Age. And what I hope is, as we go through this material, you'll find that it is as interesting and captivating for you as it certainly has been for me. I want to thank the British Association for Psychological Type for having the vision to sponsor this event, sponsor this symposium, and to take a look at the important questions around psychological type and how we can utilize psychological type going forward. In particular, I would say that this group of contributors are certainly some of really the most important contributors in the field of psychological type, and it's a delight to be a part of this particular team. Useful for you perhaps to know that in my thinking about type, and I hope that as we will always do in the future, is we won't lose the roots, if you will, of some of Carl Jung's propositions. This particular quote in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections has been of special importance to me because it's here that Jung has told us that the purpose of his book was really about how to really get a sense of what consciousness is all about, and by extension, unconscious dynamics and energies, and how all of those things participate in our perceptions and judgments, both its limits and its possibilities. This particular quote speaks to one of the main purposes that many people use psychological type for, which is to help people understand their differences and how it is we can, in fact, find consensus and work together. As this cartoon would suggest, the dogs and the cats are coming from such different views that maybe consensus isn't possible. Jung even made the observation toward the end of psychological types that perhaps people are incapable of understanding and accepting another point of view rather other than their own. He goes on later to say, unless there is goodwill, and certainly many of us use psychological type in the hope of, in fact, contributing to the goodwill of individuals and groups for their own growth and development. I'm always humbled by much of the complexity of Jung's thought, and he made this statement in one of his letters that we should essentially be careful about the words we use and to make sure that we, I read the quote as really saying we need to be propositional and hypothetical, because if we're not, we are speaking in absolute terms when it comes to human psychology that could be a dangerous perspective. Now, in my work with type, and certainly the most significant contribution in my research around psychological type really was a piece that was done where the Center for Creative Leadership allowed me to access the database, where we had data from the literally thousands of managers in a whole host of variables. We had the CPI, we had 3 multi-raters, we had the FIRO-B, we had all kinds of data points to do comparisons among the types. And the analysis was very extensive. I'm going to say a little more about vector 3 analysis as we get into the presentation. And some of these other factors that you see listed here, I'm not able to talk about today simply because of time, but just please know that these particular items have significantly contributed to much of the writing that I've done over the years, as I have attempted to base my comments and observations about psychological type from as much of an evidence-based perspective as possible. And the things I have produced, everything from hardwired leadership, the I'm not crazy, I'm not you, I'm just not you, which is in its 3rd edition, and the other pieces, such as the book You, Being More Effective in Your MBTI Type, and ultimately my own tool, the Pearman Personality Integrator, which has come at type from a very, very different perspective. I did not want to come at type with just simply accepting some of Meyer's propositions, in part because I happen to think her propositions work at one level of understanding type. I suspect, though, for many of us, understanding the entire engine of psychological type becomes really important to help us move beyond one-sidedness, which often can occur when we become overly identified with a particular typology. So in my work, I have had as my own personal why a line from Emily Dickinson, which is to, as she put it, ignite the imagination and light the slow fuse of the possible. And I happen to believe in a very practical way, psychological type enables us to do that with individuals. It, in fact, ignites their imagination about what is possible and really um, moves them toward development in a constructive, positive way. Jung reminds us that development is a hard thing. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. He says that you have to take yourself seriously, and if so, it's going to require a great deal of energy, and it will tax us to the utmost. Now, Robert Johnson, who was, as you may know, you may have read many of his pieces, He and She and Ecstasy, and other works that he's done. He and I had a conversation back in the late 70s, early 80s, in which he told a story which essentially went like this, that there was a man walking in the woods and he came upon this remarkable stream. And he realized that this stream, when he sipped from the stream, it inspired, it ignited in him energies and gave him a kind of, if you will, I don't want to say a new lease on life, but it inspired him in ways and energized him in ways and gave him insight in ways he'd never had before. And so when he went to town and he shared it with folks, they wanted to have a sip from this spectacular stream of water as well. And they did, and the story grew. And before long, there were people who had power and who said, you know, we need to control this. And so they built a fence around the stream and started charging admission for people to come and have a sip from this special stream of water. And the story goes, the stream got angry about this and dried up. And as the story goes, somewhere else in the world, a man was walking in the woods and he came upon a stream that had certain remarkable qualities. Jung suggested in telling this story, and Robert Johnson in repeating it, that truth can't be bought, that truth and insight and wisdom are available to us when we allow ourselves, but we should be very careful in the way we treat it and the way we bring it forth into the world, because once we start making it the part of the privileged, it dries up and no longer has its power. Now, as I've already quoted this particular point of view from Jung, that type, as he said, determines and limits our judgment. And by that, I think he meant that if you were primarily a person who had a particular, let's say, extroverted, intuiting, perceiving mode, that by virtue of the fact that that's where you put a lot of energy, you were less likely to be attuned to the other three kinds of information that can become available to you through introverted sensing and extroverted sensing and introverted intuiting. And so because of that limitation, you wind up not having all the information. Likewise, if introverted thinking is your primary judgment mode, there are three other kinds of processing and analyzing and evaluating information that's being ignored. And so as a result, our judgment is limited. The beauty of type, though, is it invites us to learn more about those other processes and those ways that we can, and that we can use them in more intentional ways to help us adapt and respond to life in constructive ways. Jung reminded in many letters, he made the statement that too many have succumbed to the error of thinking that the general description of the types are fixed labels. And he railed against the use of those as fixed labels. And he reminds, for example, around extroversion and introversion, that they're not traits of character, but mechanisms which can, as it were, be switched on or off at will, only from their habitual predominance that do corresponding characters develop. And so let's be mindful that Jung thought of the 8 functions of psychological type in a more fluid way than the way it's often presented and talked about today. I would encourage that as we think about psychological type moving forward into the future, that we don't forego the lessons of the past, but that we use them in mindful ways, if you will, to productively use psychological type as a way of understanding the human psyche, and that in fact we can get a handle on how these elements of the psyche contribute to human well-being and overall human effectiveness. Carol Shumate has made, I think, some fabulous observations that that really do need to be repeated. She says in her most recent book, Projection and Personality Development via the 8 Function Model, she says that the 8 functions are modes of consciousness, not the contents of consciousness. And I think that's a huge distinction that often gets forgotten, and that the behaviors are sourced in these functions, but not equivalent to them. And I think that subtlety is quite profound, and one that we need to keep in mind, that it's not only are we unable to dramatically predict with great accuracy what all the abilities and skills are going to be from a person based on their type leanings, but certainly the kinds of things people are likely to develop by virtue of the way those type functions in fact get used in everyday life. Also want to remind us that when Jung, in some extensive conversations with Marie von Franz, wanted to talk about the importance of science and the importance of numbers and how numbers are to be utilized. And this becomes important when we start looking at the data that I want to share with you today. In fact, what von Franz said, and as I said, this is a byproduct of listening in on Jung's conversations about number and time, is that numbers help us access some deep archetypal energies, and that in fact numbers are ways of getting a handle on one aspect of our time-space dimensions that we live in, and that in fact numbers, specific numbers, have very specific meaning, and that we should be attentive to those energies when we start talking about numbers. And of course, we know in science, the use of numbers and the use of what's thought of as numerical tactics and strategies are intended to help us get at what's referred to as a more objective view, and I would say help us get to some consensus about what it is we may be experiencing. A lot of folks have forgotten that Myers, in her work, Myers made it a point to talk about the dynamic of the whole. She didn't talk about just extroversion or introversion when she thought type. She thought about type in terms of extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling, and introverted feeling, and introverted sensing and extroverted, and how those work together to make a dynamic pattern. The publisher through the years has increasingly atomized the preferences and some of the descriptions, such that much of her subtlety, Myers' subtlety, has been lost. And she is quite apparent in the last part of her life when she studied type. Myers looked at the types as units of measure. She didn't look at just E or I. She looked at what ESTJ was like compared to ESTP, etc. She had sufficiency scales, which were the precursors to step 2 and 3 as we know it today. But if you have had any access to her research, you know she had very elaborate additional scales to help understand what she believed was most central to type, which was type development. Gordon Lawrence felt so strongly about Meyer's original descriptions of types that he included it in People, Types, and Tiger Stripes, his last edition of that book, which is available today. As we know, the way Myers defined type development, she said that type development was knowing your type and knowing the other functions and when to use them, and to use them effectively. And so to be able to do that, you have to understand what all of those functions are and what their capabilities are and the ways in which they may show up in your individual life. Now, in my work, and I really feel quite strongly about some of these things that I'm going to share with you. I often have been asked to write comments about the criticisms of the MBTI or other psychological tools, psychological type tools in particular, tools that have utilized Meyer's same hypotheses, but they've come at it in some different ways. I've reminded when I've been a part of these panels where critics wanted to talk about how unscientific the MBTI is, I asked them if in fact they think IRT analysis and latent factor analysis matter. And of course, everybody in the field of psychological studies will tell you, especially personality studies, IRT is among the most powerful statistical models we have today. And when I say to them, well, you know, the MBTI was revised using IRT, they usually are in disbelief. And I send them to the manual, especially the 94 manual, which goes over the IRT analysis. And then, of course, the most recent revision. And both the 94 and the most recent revision, the 2016 revision, we have panels of PhDs who are doing this analysis, both independent panels as well as panels within the publisher's house, if you will. And so I think it's kind of interesting to me that the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and by extension, other type tools, keep being criticized as being unscientific, and yet the highest standards of measurement have been applied to the MBTI, and yet it seems unrecognized. I find that quite fascinating. As I've looked at the various criticisms of the indicator, the MBTI, and other type tools, and of course, my concern about protecting psychological type, because I think it's a powerful, precious framework and model, precious in that it is so constructive in its approach to understanding the human psyche and what we can do to expand the use of our various gifts. And I wanted to do some additional work. I wanted to follow up on my work in the mid-90s. And I wanted to see, do we have enough observational evidence to begin to claim that these functions are real and that, in fact, there is enough evidence to argue for talking about this theory as a legitimate theory of understanding the human psyche. Now, when Mary McCauley asked me in the early 80s about research, she said to me, I want you to promise me that the work you do will always be to make sure you highlight type as a unit of measure. And by that, she meant when you're going to do a comparison and an analysis, compare the whole, let's say that the scores of ISTJs as a group, that's the unit, with ISTPs and with ISFJs and ISFPs. And in other words, don't play with the particular preferences themselves, but look at the whole type as a unit of measure to have a sense of this dynamic energy that Myers had hypothesized. So this particular grid shows you 4 factors which come from the CPI that was in the study that I did. And you can see by just scanning this that depending on the factor, there are really different reports given the type, and that in fact they report themselves very differently across the different factors. And of course, if you start breaking it out and you order it from low to high in a particular factor, you can see that some types report themselves. This particular CPI factor is called responsibility. And you need to understand it means that I view responsibility and rules as hard and fast, or suggestions and fluid. So the example I like to use is if you were in a town of several hundred people way out in the West, and they had a single stoplight, and it's 3 a.m. in the morning and nobody is there, but the light that you've come to in the intersection is red. Are you going to be a person who sits and waits for the light to change, or are you going to look around, see that there's no one there, it's 3 a.m. in the morning, you've slowed down, there's no risk, so you go on? Those who get high scores on this particular scale say they will stop. They don't care when, where, what the conditions are. If it's a red light, they stop. Those who see it as more of a contextual suggestion will say, I certainly will stop if there's a good reason to. But as I look around, it's 3 a.m. in the morning. The context tells me there's nobody else up in this 300-person town. I'm going to go ahead and move on through the intersection. Sociability, again, no surprise here, as we take a distribution and take a look at from ISTP to ENTP, how the types have self-reported their degree of sociability. But again, the message here is the wonderful distribution across the types, and how it is that as each type describes themselves, we can see that those descriptions carry very, very important differential meanings. Here's another one: independence. How independent-minded are you? And who would be surprised, to those who've worked with type a lot, that INTJs report themselves as among the most independent-minded, and ISFJs do not report themselves as being independent-minded and having a pursuit of independence in working through situations. Conceptual fluency is another concept on the CPI, where again we expect to see differences by type. Who loves concepts, who loves to play with concepts versus who loves more concrete things. And again, no surprise in the distribution of the 16 types as measured by the MBTI. Yet on the way each of these types describe themselves on this factor, we see that there are qualitative differences over time. Well, this is the kind of using type as a whole unit of measure that I've been doing throughout my professional life. And it was what drove me really when I and my business partner at the time, Sarah Albritton, created our first edition of I'm Not Crazy, I'm Just Not You. We really wanted to have what I thought of as empirically driven descriptions of the types from all of the data that came in that analysis that I referred to a little earlier. And in fact, that analysis enabled me, because of the multi-rater data, to do something quite unique and special, and that was to begin to identify which behaviors seem to emanate the most from each of the 8 functions, which then, of course, influenced the creation of the Pearman Personality Integrator. So I'm just wanting you to understand that the genesis of this work has come from this particular research that I've been doing for a long time. And one of the pieces that I'm going to be saying more about, hopefully in my next piece, set of work with type, has to do with, and in fact, Dario has reported some of this material, the fact that when I looked at a variable called ego integration, and I took a look at those who were low on that measure across each of the 16 types, and those who were high on that measure across each of the 16 types, you could really see some differences in how they were described in what I would call more character-like stereotypical descriptions when there was a poor score on this factor, and very fluid learning agile descriptions regardless of the type of those on the high end. And this led me to want to take a look at what are some of the factors that get in the way of people acknowledging and utilizing the whole array of psychological resources that they have. And what I found as I looked at the data and as I looked at my own coaching practice is that I often heard the statement when people got their MBTI results or one of the other type tools that we might use from time to time, they would say, well, this is me at work, this isn't me at home. And when I would say, well, gosh, tell me what the differences are, and they would describe those, and I would say, well, does this create strain in you in your life when you feel that you're having to constantly behave in ways that's different from what may feel more comfortable for you? And then that led to very interesting discussions and discoveries about, gosh, maybe we should be asking the question, what do you feel most comfortable in using and doing, and what do you feel you have to do? And if there's strain, how does that strain get in the way of being able to flex such that you use a different form of perception or a different form of judgment, which is at the very basis of, if you will, a more ego-integrated, mature mind. So I must say that as I've taken a look at the reports over the last number of years, I'm consistently disappointed that whole type data is not reported, not even by the publisher of the MBTI or the other tools that are being used to produce a 4-letter code. We know there haven't been independent research publications on type now for any number of years, and research on type has essentially been banned from a lot of academic journals where it's been clearly discredited as a model, and the MBTI discredited as a tool, which is fascinating when you take a look at what I consider to be the compelling evidence. And of course, when you start looking at, well, what is popular, almost always the 5-factor model gets talked about as the way in which we should understand personality. And of course, we know type is not about personality per se. And we shouldn't put it in that category, but it often gets thrown in that category. And I really wanted to, with the Pearman Personality Integrator, I wanted to invite the concept of how those 8 functions are available and accessible. And as we look at the validity and reliability evidence, both of almost all of the personality tools that are being published out there, they're very substantial pieces of evidence for them. And in parallel areas like the Mayer and Salovey EQ assessment, they talk about the 8 capabilities of EQ, which have an absolute perfect parallel to the 8 functions that Jung had hypothesized in the ways in which he described them. We're probably all aware of the recent PSYOP letter, which pretty much was in response to a kind of docudrama of sorts that was put out by HBO Max and CNN called Persona, which talked about the MBTI in not very glowing terms. And PSYOP felt compelled to make a statement that the piece was not good science reporting, and the indicator, after all, the MBTI is not a scientifically sound tool, which is a rather remarkable thing when you start looking at evidence like this. This is a little exercise that I use with some professional groups who want to complain about the MBTI in particular. And I'll say, okay, how many of you heard of the CPI? And everybody, almost anybody who's been trained in the industry knows about the California Psychological Inventory, or the Hogan, or the 5-factor model, or the adjective checklist, and more people these days with the Pearman. And I'll say, well, here's some reliability coefficients that match up with these various assessments, but I've not listed them in the order of the matchup. So which do you think the CPI has as a range of test retest coefficients? What about the MBTI? What's the range of coefficients that work? And everybody misses it, of course. The CPI, based on the manual, has the broadest range of test retest measures. And of course, Harrison Goff argues that this is as it should be, because he believed his instrument was highly subject to contextual factors. The Hogan, which is often seen and discussed as if it were delivered from the gods, it has acceptable and moderate test retest reliability. It's really when you get to the MBTI, do you find that the reliabilities are robust in test retest measures? And so I'll do this exercise to try to illustrate that if you're going to use a standard to declare something as unreliable, well, gosh, where does the standard work for the other assessments that you use and that you claim to be so very, very important? Well, the question of the validity of the model and the tools themselves, they're sort of intertwined issues, gets to be kind of interesting. We know that when a lot of people try to validate type or validate a tool, they do correlational studies, and I really contend that that has a limited value. It's almost always a correlation of E and I to some other factor. And of course, how many EI correlations to gregariousness or sociability or some other form of interpersonal engagement do we need to establish the fact that this construct of extroversion and introversion is real? From a type perspective, that's not the most interesting question. The most interesting question is, what form of extroversion, what form of introversion is at play and working, and how do we understand it more fully and richly and make sense of it for ourselves and in working with others? Certainly comparison studies, we need more of those. We desperately need more whole type studies, looking at the sort of lab work that Dario Nardi's been doing from his lab studies. Is certainly very, very important, and he's been looking at whole type and how typologically different brain activities are. We need more observational studies. What do the types look like and look like under various conditions, as well as what I think of as more type functionality validity studies. My deep look at the functions and using the research teams of multi-health systems, we were able to establish the realness of those functions and the creation of the tool. Now, we know the 5-factor model is the most popular model, and it shows a lot of correlations with typological factors. How can we be surprised that we see that, for example, the extroversion, introversion dimension of the 5-factor model is related to E&I of psychological type. Openness to experience is very much related to sensing and intuiting. Agreeableness is thinking and feeling, and conscientiousness about degrees of flexibility and degrees of dutifulness and discipline and structure. So all of those correlations have done a number of times between tools like the MBTI and five-factor tools, and there are multiple five-factor tools, which of course are of value to see those relationships because it contributes one to the other with the argument that there's something real going on here that's worth paying attention to. The five-factor model, as we know, the fifth factor has to do with what was referred to initially as neuroticism. And there's been a great deal of work in our type field to kind of avoid getting into that arena, not to say that it's not real, but ultimately, what does neuroticism mean in everyday life? And it has to do with flexibility, and has to do with how much energy is going into anxiety and preventing us from flexing as we need to going into coping strategies, enabling us to flex as we need to in order to respond effectively and constructively to the situations in which we find ourselves. In multiple studies, this is just one again, where I've been able to take the MBTI and five-factor tools. You will see that all of the low scores on the five-factor models highly correlate with ISTJ, and all the high scores highly correlate with ENFJ. So the ISTP is described in these five-factor models as a somewhat difficult, hypercritical individual who doesn't seem to work in conscientious ways, where the ENFJ is described as warm, thoughtful, imaginative, open to experiences, and is the kind of person who follows the to-do list. Well, those descriptions aren't what we in the typological world would see as healthy descriptions of those patterns. And yet the intersection, the point being, the intersection is robust and clear between the five-factor framing, which is so popular today and almost no one questions its validity, and typological patterns, which in fact come at these factors in a constructive kind of way. So when we start looking at the content relationship between the MBTI and the five-factor model, it's pretty clear that there is a lot of territory they share. And in that shared territory and in that shared evidence confirm the reality of the factors that they are paying attention to. Now, I like to use multi-rater data tools because it helps us deal with questions that the Johari window proposes to us. One is, if there are things I'm doing that I know and you see and you know, and you and I agree that I'm doing those things, then we have an arena. We have a consensual reality that we've agreed that, yes, I do certain things out of habit. You see those certain things, and we can agree that this must be true for me. There are things I may be doing that I'm totally unaware of, that prompts, nervous tics, certain words, phrases that I'm using that I'm not even conscious of using them, that you may pick up on. And insofar as I don't know those things, and especially if those things irritate you, then I have a blind spot. There are things I may hold back, I may not share, I may not show, and I may be very consciously controlling. And insofar as I do that, I have created a facade. And then, of course, there are circumstances that emerge where we both respond out of unconscious energies, and we know that is clearly in the source of projection. So I use multi-rater tools to help people enhance their self-awareness and enhance their capacity to understand their impact on others. This is one of the reasons why I created the Type 360 tool, was because I wanted people to have observations from others about how the 8 functions were being demonstrated in some way, And the analysis that enabled me to get to this, as I referred to earlier, came from the massive analysis I did at the Center for Creative Leadership, where we were able to look at very discrete behaviors and attach those through various analysis to various typological functions. In the creation of Type 360, it certainly has won some innovation awards. It's a tool where individuals get raters from multiple groups: a boss, peers, direct reports, others. It's not uncommon for others to be family members or close friends. And people are asked to identify how frequently these 64 behaviors are and how effectively those behaviors are demonstrated, and in fact, how important they are for a person to be effective in their particular context or setting. And it is my observation as a coach that a behavior that is very important and is very effective but not done frequently is a different development question than a behavior that's very important, that's done a lot, that's ineffective. There's a different coaching strategy and a different approach that we need to take there. And so I have developed this tool with a coaching interaction in mind that ultimately protects the strength, if you will, of an individual and highlight the areas that they might access to enrich their work. So you might ask, well, what are some examples of items? And so the items that make up extroverted thinking, again, keep in mind, these came from an analysis from multiple multi-raters that were sorted by type and type functions. So things like ask tough questions when analyzing situations. Don't think anyone would doubt that extroverted thinking would encourage that kind of behavior, that the nature of extroverted thinking is that way. Extroverted thinking often pushes for accountability and responsibilities. It's a driver for seeing that behavior gets displayed. Another one would be introverted feeling items. And so in this analysis, there was evidence that folks who had introverted feeling as a primary driver in their psyche were individuals who wanted to make sure that their ideals were in fact manifest and aligned with tasks and challenges that they had, or that in fact they were evaluating options based on mission and purpose when they were making choices. So I would just say that when these items were created, it came from as strict analysis as we could get to what seems to be emanating from these different functions. Well, I started collecting data, and I invite you, and I'll give you this information at the end of this presentation if you want to participate. I've been collecting data, and I wanted to get as much data as possible to find out, do we have observational evidence of the functions and the types? And you see at the moment the verified type table of the 1,600 in this analysis so far. Far more and in the type world and the folks who I have had a chance to work with, they're certainly more NFs. We know from a type distribution perspective that's not true. But in this collection of data so far, that's been where we are. So I've wanted to find out what were the rater agreements, meaning how much agreement between the raters was there on each person. What are the percentages of rater agreement with the verified types? And indeed, what are the kinds of correlations amongst the raters on type estimated behaviors? And what are the means and comparisons in terms of what's seen from a dominant and auxiliary perspective using the hypothesis that Myers gave us about dominant auxiliary, and looking at the means of the 8 functions, and the tool that was used in the sorting was in fact based on the MBTI, 16 MBTI types. So if we take a look at the first sort of question, where there are anywhere between 3 to 15 raters, for each of these various individuals who fall within each of these 16 groups, we see that there's a great deal of rater agreement, meaning the people they asked to rate them, who, when I ask and would ask you if you participate in the study, to have people who know you, people who have a chance to spend time with you, who are able to say, gosh, I'm around this person enough to report on how frequently these behaviors show up. And here we see within the raters, within each of these groups, there's a great deal of rater agreement that these behaviors are real as identified within each of those rater groups. I also wanted to know what was the agreement between the raters, if you will, patterns, and the verified type. In other words, when the person said, I believe I'm an INTJ, those are my preferences, and we looked at the raters, were the raters identifying the pattern that's true for INTJs? And you can see that there is often a great deal of consistency between what the raters observed and what the individuals said was their verified type. And in my mind, this gives us a fairly strong argument that, in fact, gosh, if I've understood my pattern and you are observing me and you see this pattern, then that pattern has some realness to it that I should be paying attention to understand my impact on others and understanding how I operate in the world. I also mentioned in the analysis of taking a look at means. And as you see here, looking at the dominant and auxiliary as hypothesized by Myers amongst all of the STs, and then amongst all except for one of the SFs, meaning the ISFJ and ISFP pattern, where we see the extroverted energy getting a little higher score of frequency than and effectiveness than the dominant. But when we look at the other typologies, we see that in fact, more often than not, what is dominant gets the higher average in terms of effectiveness across the 16 types. So again, the hypothesis that Myers gave us that there would be a greater deal of energy put into a dominant function would certainly seem to be indicated by the way these means played out when you look just at the dominant function and the auxiliary function for each of the 16 types. I also wanted to look at the 8 functions, and I used Myers' original formulation for the distribution of the 8. And you can see how those means show across for each of the 8 functions, for each of the 16 types. I'm going to be doing more analysis on these as the days unfold, but I don't want to close this early. I want to get as many in the database as I can. I had this big vision that maybe we could get 5,000 people in the database that would make a very strong argument that, in fact, this thing we call psychological type has a real presence in the world and something that we should be paying attention to. So as I've done this work and as I've looked at the history of type over decades now, there are a couple of observations I would offer as we move into the future. One is that we see in this data here, and I think in other data sets we've looked at over time, that there is confirmation of the dynamic that seems to be evident in individuals, and that confirmation is worthy of our respect and attention, that raters have been consistent across the groups, and that's useful to have so many raters say the same thing. You know, I see this pattern for an ISTJ, or I see this pattern for an ENFP, I think is quite important for us to pay attention to. In this particular analysis, the dominant is in fact, for most of the types, higher than auxiliary, as Myers and Jung hypothesized would be true. And in general, there is a kind of strength in the judgment function across the types, and Jung suggested that those would be more conscious anyway. whereas the perceiving functions were less conscious, and certainly, as he called them, less rational. I think of them as non-rational functions. I don't think of them as irrational functions at all. So as we go forward, I would say that it seems to me the criticism of the MBTI and other psychological type tools have really reached a sort of a tipping point. And now we've had a professional society declare the MBTI is not a scientifically sound tool. That's a first. We see the reduction in membership and APTs around the world, less interest in using type in all kinds of settings. And I suspect what we're going to see happen, and it's already beginning to emerge, is the use of artificial intelligence models that will increasingly be used. And I actually think this is very dangerous because artificial intelligence models are so statistically driven, they don't take into account variables like strain or conscious awareness or the kinds of things we believe are vital in understanding type, and nonetheless believe that the kind of evidence that will be put forth by AI practitioners is going to make it a very attractive way to gather data and make pronouncements about other people's behavior. I think it's going to take a serious core of us who believe that type is a real framework to understand the human psyche and to reposition it for a new age. And we need to be content with not feeling like we're losing just simply because we don't have millions of followers. I think it's a precious model that we are the trustees of, and anything we can do to help make it a more coherent theory and offer the insights and data from decades, we should. And that we should, in fact, find ways to integrate with other widely accepted forms of understanding the human being, in very much in the field of cognitive processes that are showing up in personality research. And I do think we need to pay attention to the language we use around type and look carefully at the lessons of language such that we don't use a language that tethers the theory to something that's not productive or useful over time. And that in and of itself would be a very fascinating symposium, just to take a look at the language that we use today around type and how might we moderate that language and justify that language in a way that honors the underlying principles of psychological type. And of course, a research agenda, that moves just beyond the description into what are the real meaningful applications of type as a model. And I hope that will be part of our agenda as we move forward. So if you want to participate in the study, please contact me. You can send me an email at typestudy@leadership-systems.com. It's free. I am not charging anyone who wants to participate in the study. There's a protocol I'll send you, and you'll understand what that protocol is and how this works. You just need at least 3 people who can say that they've observed your behavior and are willing to take the time to rate those 64 behaviors, 8 for each of the 8 functions. And I hope that some of you will, in fact, agree to participate. It's been my privilege to be a part of this symposium and to bring forth the observations that I have and things that I've seen. And it is my sincere hope that, in fact, we will rediscover that stream and that we will be better stewards and trustees of that stream going forward, because I believe it is our hope in making type as vital for the next generation as possible. Thank you very much for your willingness to listen in. And if you have questions, feel free to contact me, Roger Pearman at yahoo.com or the type study at leadership-.